Welcome to Techcipe. This is a channel where we explore and implement technologies. We're going to look at all kinds of solutions and implement them on a blow by blow manner. Our call is to mentor through experiments. So, whatever we're going to do here, you can pick it and run with it and configure your solutions either for yourself, for your clients, or as you wish. Let's now look at the cloud. So if we do the cloud, now we said we can either go to Hyperscalers or we go to alt cloud. Now for alt cloud, I just want to be a bit more specific. We can do alt clouds where we do virtual machines or we do bare metal. And I'm going to explain all this. So let's start with the hyperscalers. So you see the hyperscalers, these are your Amazon, Google Cloud, and all that. So again, we come back to our solution. So this is what we are still hosting, okay? We said we have 50 employees. It's a real estate company. We have a CRM software. This CRM software needs to be accessed by employees, customers, as well as integration with other third-party systems. For example, banks, M-Pesa, all that. So if we take it to Amazon, we have the benefit of one thing. Remember, Amazon is not a Kenyan company. It's not an African company. So it starts from the US. They have presence in Europe, okay? And in Africa, they only have one place where they are available. That is in South Africa, okay? So if we are in Kenya here, somewhere in the middle here, the closest place for us to host our services would be South Africa, okay? So the same for Microsoft Azure, okay? So the closest place would be South Africa. We can also go to Europe, for example. It would be as I prefer it as a second option, okay? Latencies here, that is the speed from here, normally ranges to around 200 milliseconds. Latencies from Kenya to South Africa ranges to around 70 to around 90 milliseconds. So you see, we've already entered the 2-digit mark, which is very good for latencies. Okay. However, in the previous example where I gave, either we do a data center or we do the office, latencies would be less than 10 milliseconds. In the office, it will probably be 1 or 2. In the data center, it will be maximum. It will be 1 digit, basically. Less than 10. Yeah, less than 10 is 1 digit. So let's say maybe 5 milliseconds. So you can see the difference. Now, we have chosen to host our data in Hyperscaler. I'll take the example of AWS. The dynamics are the same. The only thing that changes is the language, the syntax, and stuff like that. But basically, it's almost the same. However, AWS is the top hyperscaler in the world. It takes position 1 in terms of market, in terms of many other things. Okay, so let's take AWS. So if we host it in AWS, we now go to the person who sold us the software and ask them what are the requirements to run the software for 50 people. They probably tell us you need 2 CPUs, you need 4 GB RAM, and probably storage space in terms of hard disk, maybe around 50 GB disk space. Okay, so we will go to AWS and buy exactly this. Okay, we're going to buy this as a virtual machine. Okay, again, for us to take this decision, we're going to look at the factors that we are considering. Number 1 is costs. Okay, number 2 is security. Number 3 is compliance. And number 4 is responsibility. Okay. Now, we've said we've gone to AWS, we've bought exactly what we need for our CRM. We need only these specs. So once we buy that, how I'm just trying to fix this thing and see how I will do it. How I will do it is this: I would buy the VM, and then I'm going to hook this VM to an ELB, a load balancer, so that when I write maybe let's CRM dot Techcipe, let's assume we are going to how we are going to get here. We go on the website and write crm.techcipe.com, for example. If we go to this site, it's going to take us to this. So this, I'm going to point this domain to this load balancer. This load balancer is going to go to the VM. The reason I do this is because I could potentially decide, since this is a mission critical VM, I'm going to have it in more than one availability zone, right? And I'm going to section it differently. So remember we said hyperscalers, they have different availability zones, and probably we'll come and discuss that later. But first of all, let's just talk about the example so that we don't get lost. Okay, so we want now to gauge this based on this. Now, in terms of cost, do we have a capex cost? Zero. We have zero capex cost. We are not buying any server, we are not buying any security equipment, no server room, nothing. But we have an OPEX cost, operational expense, at a cost that we pay month to month. Now, we said this company is not a Kenyan company, so you're mostly paying in USD. That means if your OPEX costs are, for example, 1,000 USD every month, depending on what kind of stuff you've done there, then it means if the dollar rate goes up, you are affected. It goes down, you are affected, either positively or negatively. So that is a factor to consider. The other thing is, so in terms of cost, this is the only thing you do. Of course, you still pay somebody to do the setup initially. Of course, you pay somebody to check on your environment in terms of cybersecurity and all that. And mostly these people will use, for example, we use certain tools to ensure consistency, to give us alerts, because again, we said we don't deploy the principle of management by walking around. We use tools which help us to know what is happening in the environment and give us alerts. So in terms of OPEX, now you have so much more to think about. However, this VM, you can tell it, maybe you're doing backups. They are handled on AWS using a different service. Remember we said hyperscalers, there are thousands of services. So security, there's a service for that. Backup, there's a service for that. In terms of what? Availability, load balancing, I mean, you can go crazy on the features that are there. There's a service for that, which pushes these costs high and high the more you consume those services. Now, in terms of security, are we more secure? Technically, we are more secure. Why? The environment itself is very secure. Physical security is guaranteed. In terms of the number of mistakes that you can make in terms of misconfiguration, there are ways to go around it. For example, if let's say in our VM or in our VM we expose a port like SSH, right? We can configure rules in our environment on AWS so that if it captures a misconfiguration of normal issues like an exposed SSH or RDP port, then it can give us an alert. Maybe in your organization you have the top engineer and you have some junior engineers. Okay, the junior engineer will come and set up this environment, and if he does a basic misconfiguration, an email can be sent to this guy. So there are many things that they've taken care of. So in terms of security, we are doing very well. You still can have misconfiguration. For example, if it is AWS and you have something like an S3 bucket that is publicly accessible, what this means is that if you store, for example, company documents, maybe you've stored your CV there and everybody's CV and blah, 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 and then you make it online. I can potentially go online, download the files, and now I have all the company records as if I'm an employee. So there are a few misconfigurations that you can make that can make it potentially insecure, but you have significantly increased your security. You do not need any firewalls. You subscribe to the services of the firewalls that they have. In terms of compliance, you inherit a lot. Okay? You inherit a lot of compliance. So ISO 2700. Now, these services, and we'll have a look at them. These services, they have a lot of certifications, whether it is ISO 27001. So if your organization is being vetted for these and your environment is in AWS, then you potentially inherit a lot from them. Okay. In terms of compliance with local laws, now that may be a challenge. How so? For example, the Kenya Data Protection Act mandates that if you're transferring data, so it looks at something we call data residency. Okay, so that you have to know where your data resides and you have to declare it. Okay, this is because let's say, for example, you're doing a public app, and this app is probably the data is probably residing in a country that does not have very strict cybersecurity laws and all those things. Then it would be a concern because you're putting your customers' data at risk. So that is something you have to take in consideration when you're choosing the region where your data is going to be, data residency. So those are things that now you have to consider. Responsibility. Now, AWS have what we call a responsibility matrix. So you are only responsible for this VM. Now, since this is a virtual machine, remember it is somewhere, even if not, you don't know, it is somewhere in a bare metal server. Okay? This bare metal server has network connected to it. Okay? This network, has internet also. Okay? All these systems are behind some power protection. For example, maybe UPS or the inverter system that I was talking about, probably even multiple sources of grid. Okay? Maybe multiple sources of grid. Okay? Grid power. Now, this part you're not responsible. You don't care about it. This part is managed by the hyperscaler. In this case, AWS. Your responsibility here is only on the VM. And on the VM is not the uptime, it's the configuration of this VM, the security of the VM, the patch management, updates and all those kind of things. So your responsibility significantly goes down relative to on-prem. Okay? On-prem or data center setup. Now, again, it will sound and feel very rosy and beautiful, but one of the catch here is about this. This operational expense, this is the biggest catch when it comes to AWS. And again, we'll look at it later. Now, I want us to go to Alt Cloud. Now, we've looked at hyperscalers. Now, we want to take the same application, but this time host it in an alternative cloud. Now, alternative cloud, we say this is like Digital Ocean. We also have OVH. Now there are several, but allow me to just focus on the two. Now, for for these, you can either host it as a VM, the same way we did in Hyperscaler, or you can go to the bare metal server setup, the same way we did in the on-prem setup. Okay. Now, I'm going to use DigitalOcean to handle VM, and I'm going to use OVH to handle bare metal, like this. So here we're going to talk about DigitalOcean OVH. Okay. However, a distinction to make is this: OVH has the potential to even do VMs. In fact, better still, so that we compare apples for apples, you're going to host the data as a VM in OVH or as a bare metal server in OVH. Okay. Now, if we do it as a VM, again, we go to the vendor and ask the vendor, what are the specs? They had already given us 2 GB CPU, 2 CPU, 2 GB, 2 GB RAM, 50 GB disk. Okay. Now there's a distinction, by the way. That's why I'm rubbing the B. Capital B is bytes, and B is bits. We always measure data in bits, not bytes. And bytes is bits times 8. So if I say 2 GB and I put a capital B, that essentially is 16 GB. Okay. Now, so we have gone to to our vendor, and our vendor has told us the CRM, this is what you need. So we are going to go to OVH and we are going to buy a VM for this size. Now, OVH does not have too many features. However, we can also put a load balancer here. It's not as straightforward as AWS, but you can also put a load balancer there, so that when you go to crm.techcipe.com, okay, we go to the load balancer, it goes to the disk. Or we can do away with the load balancer and going to this leads us directly here, as you wish. There are different security things to consider, but you need to know, it depends on how you want to set it up. Now, there's something very, very, very significant here that you need to understand. And the reason why I'm saying you can go directly here is because even if you go directly here, OVH, for example, gives you a firewall. And so do even DigitalOcean. They give you a firewall where you can say, the access that is going here, what am I allowing? So I can say, for example, I only want to allow HTTPS traffic, port 443. Okay? That's the only thing that is going to hit this public IP. Okay? I can also, better still, I can put, and that is actually a better setup. Instead of using the load balancer here, I can put Cloudflare here. Put Cloudflare in the middle, okay? So that now Techcipe takes me to Cloudflare, and then when I leave Cloudflare, I go to my VM. Now this is already better because Cloudflare handles DDoS and so many other services. As well, at the same time, DigitalOcean, whatever they give you, they've already handled DDoS for you. Distributed denial of service. Okay? They've already handled it for you, and a few basic security things. So that is when they give you a VM and all that. Now, again, we come and gauge against our metrics. Our metric is cost, security, compliance, and responsibility. So in terms of costs, I can assure you, the cost of this VM is a fraction of the cost in a hyperscaler data center. So the cost will be significantly low compared to hyperscale. Okay, the cost is low. In terms of operational cost, again, I'm just maintaining the VM here. The technical expertise required is not as much as what is required to configure AWS or Azure. So the engineer that you're paying to do this may not be, depends, may not be so much highly paid like an AWS engineer. And so many other things. So the cost is significantly low. And by significantly low, I mean maybe even half the cost that you'd have there. The second thing is this: the cost is predictable. Now, the good thing about hyperscalers is that the cost is dependent on usage. So for example, if my VM is our CRM is very busy, let's say we are serving 10,000 customers, okay? I'm going to pay significantly higher here because of the traffic that is going through the link than if I'm serving 1,000 customers, okay? So, and again, just to make it feel, let's say 100,000 customers, okay? Versus 1,000 customers. So I'm going to pay significantly higher, okay? Now, in terms of security, do I get better security? Again, it's a little bit lower than what I would get at a hyperscaler, but still very good. Now, it all depends. Now, it all depends on the person doing the setup for you. If they do a good job, you're good. In terms of security, you're sorted, okay? Because now you implement a few security setups. There are ways that you can architect these to make sure you have a very good setup. That is, you don't have to break the bank basically to host your service in the cloud. And we can do it for you. Number two, so the security is lower as compared to these, but can be the same. Can be same or even higher. Can be the same or even higher. This is dependent on how you architect this. In terms of compliance, you don't borrow as much compliance as you would from these guys. However, you still inherit a significant amount of compliance. Okay. Responsibility. Now, the responsibility here again is the same as the responsibility here, because you don't worry about any server or anything. Your responsibility is on the configuration of the VM, on the security of the data that is there, and stuff like that. So responsibility is the same. We can say it is equal. Now, that is a virtual machine on OVH, an alternative cloud provider. Okay. Let us look at securing this data in a bare metal server. Now, this is my favorite. It's my favorite because the amount of the freedom of thought is amazing. Now, a bare metal server, what this means is this. Remember the on-prem setup that we had? We went and bought a server. Now, when you buy a server, you get a physical box, metallic box, which has everything physical. It's just like a computer blown up in many proportions, okay? So you have the CPU. Let's say you got the CPU. It has maybe something like 24 cores, okay? You have the RAM. You probably bought RAM 64 cores, 64 MBs. Sorry, GB of RAM, okay? you went to the disk, you bought NVMe storage of say 500, and because you're smart, you bought 2 of them so that you can set up RAID configuration. Okay, and because I think you're even smarter, you bought 3 of them so that you can have RAID configuration and have a RAID configuration where you have, you can potentially lose more drives, because here you can do RAID 1, here you can do RAID 5. Okay, now once you got this server, in this server, that is where you come and create a VM. Now remember the VM that we are talking about, where the vendor who sold to you the CRM told you it needs 2 CPUs, it needs 2 GB of RAM, and it needs 50 GB disk. Okay, you came and housed this VM inside this server, which means, looking at the specs, if you're talking about 2 CPUs, you still have, you've not exhausted the CPUs. RAM, you've not exhausted the RAM, you have 64. You can do potentially 10 of these or more. Okay, now take that concept, take this server, and instead of buying it where you acquire it and put it in your office or in a data center, you go talk to OVH and you tell them, I want to lease it. Okay, so technically you'd lease it maybe for 1 year, 3 years, and so on and so forth. However, you pay per month. Okay, so what have you avoided? Let's go back to our metrics. In terms of costs, OPEX cost 0. You have not bought anything in terms of OPEX cost, you've not acquired anything. However, in terms of CAPEX, now you are leasing a server. Okay, however, you're not leasing a VM, you're leasing much more on the server. You're leasing the whole server. The costs relative to the value that you get is like a third or a quarter. Okay, the cost of buying these either as a VM or in hyperscaler is like a quarter the amount of you pay for the entire server. Now, in terms of OPEX, you have to think about, for example, the configuration that you're going to put here. So, for example, if it is, actually it's not going to affect the OPEX, sorry. If it is security, how is security? It is even. Let's say it is even in this sense. Whatever you applied on your bare metal environment or your your on-prem environment or your office is what you have simply come here. The only thing you have replaced is your cost. The only significant thing you've replaced here is the cost. Okay? So in terms of security, you're even depending on the configuration and the engineer who is handling your work. In terms of compliance, you still inherit a bit of compliance from OVH because they are certified and their data centers are certified in a certain way. So you still inherit a bit of compliance. So it's a lesser burden for you. But since now you are not vetting the VM, you are now vetting the entire CPU and even the network connected to the CPU and all that, then in terms of compliance, you have a higher burden on your side. How about responsibility? Remember, in hyperscaler, because you're comparing hyperscaler and OVH, in hyperscaler we said, and to some extent the VM, in hyperscaler we said you don't care about the hardware, you don't care about the power, you don't care about, all that. You don't care about the server, you don't care about the power, you don't care about the internet. Now, in this setup where you have a bare metal server, The only thing you don't care about is this, the power and the internet. The server is your ultimate responsibility, because if you misconfigure this server and expose everything in the cloud, you have potentially, maybe you get a compromise, you've potentially compromised 10 VMs. So in terms of responsibility, you need to know what you're doing for you to get this server. But in terms of cost, oh, you're going to enjoy. So now, bottom line, I'm sure you'd want us to look at, okay, anyway. So bottom line, what is my opinion? Whether to do cloud or cloud versus on-prem. So this is co-location, which is data center or office. So for this client, what do? Do we take their data on-prem or do we host their data in the cloud? Now, my opinion is this. If this client is growing at an accelerated rate, okay, they do not want to spend too much money, so low cost. Okay, so we talked about costs, security, compliance, and responsibility. And they have credible engineers. Okay, and compliance, as we said, is not a big deal. So if this client is at that level, my first choice would be to get them a bare metal server. Why a bare metal server? Number one, credible engineers. We are credible engineers. Number two, low cost server. This is the lowest cost server that you will get at the most ridiculously cheap price, and you can do amazing stuff with it. Okay. In terms of growth, as you said, the VM required, we could potentially do more than 10. We had 64 GB of RAM. Our VM probably required 4. You can see already here, how many can we run? We can run 16 of them, 16 VMs. Okay. So in terms of growth, we can, that means if the customers grow, we can continuously increase this, increase the VM or the resources of the server without incurring a single extra shilling, because we already incurred the cost by hiring the server. Okay. And as we grow, we continue expanding the infrastructure virtually. Okay. So this is kind of like we bought the server, we took it to the office, and as we grow, we keep bringing another server, you know. Now we have 3 servers in the office. We can do the same here. The only thing is that we've escaped the operational expense. Now, if the client is growing, is high, so high growth, okay? Plus, they don't care about cost. I mean, you're in an industry where you're making 100 times fold from the solution that you're hosting, okay? So costs, no issue. And you have credible engineers. Okay? Then, by all means, let us go to the hyperscale environment. And specifically, let's go to AWS. We can go to Azure. I have my reservations about that. I prefer AWS, but Azure will still do you good. But let's go to hyperscale environment. If you're in the middle, you don't have too much money, you know, growth, you know, you're growing at an accelerated rate, you still want to maintain, so growth is high, low cost. Now, you still have credible engineers, but no risk. You want to lower your risk greatly, then I would go for this, an alternative cloud, but then I do a VM. Okay, the reason for that is purely this thing that we have added here. We want to have low, not no, sorry, very low, very low risk. So in this case, all we care about is the VM, the integrity of the VM, and all that. The engineer here has to think about so many things. You're talking about virtualization, you're talking about security, right? You're talking about sizing right, the disk. Maybe you have NVMe, so you're talking about RAID configuration. There are so many things that you have to take care of here, which potentially increases the risk of your server. But if you know what you're doing, this is the best method. So for low risk, would come here. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is my verdict and how we would approach this solution. So, since we don't just talk, we like to implement, I would like us to take this scenario and actually implement it. We're going to implement it in a bare metal environment. We're going to implement it in a VM, and we are going to implement it in a hyperscale environment. So we're going to have 3 services, and I'm going to show you just to get a feel. And we're going to have exactly what we talked about here. We're going to do them on OVH, we're going to do it on AWS. See you. That sums it up for the comparison. Now, here at Techcipe, we don't just talk and talk and talk. If we love it, we love it.